In my last lecture, I totally indulged in my so-called man crush. So the lecture's title, Italian Baroque Painting, was misleading. Caravaggio was not the only Italian Baroque painter. Many of Caravaggio's contemporaries preferred Carracci and his over-the-top ceiling paintings that, like the ceiling painting in Il Jesus, used illusionistic techniques. This has shown up on the College Board before. Artemisia Gentileschi, shockingly, has dropped off the list. She followed Caravaggio's example with dramatic tenebrism, open compositions, and an unflinching interest in violence. You remember her personal story, right? I find it intriguing that women painters so frequently painted themselves in the act of pursuing their craft, maybe to reinforce their right to be artists. We know from her letters that Artemisia Gentileschi fought prejudice against women painters and struggled to get paid for her work. But in the end, she actually achieved a level of acceptance and commercial success that eluded the bad boy Caravaggio. Grand Duke Cosimo de' Medici became a major patron, and so did Charles I of England. And speaking of Charles I, this is another old AP favorite that didn't make the cut, but I'm going to use it as a segue to the painting of Flanders and Spain, and more specifically the works of Peter Paul Rubens and Diego Velázquez. Both were Catholic painters of the Counter-Reformation, but more importantly, at least for interpreting our required works, both were court painters employed to portray and reinforce the authority of Catholic monarchs. Remember that this wasn't just the age of religious wars. The 17th century, that's the 1600s, also witnessed the rise of nation-states with absolutist monarchs who had the motivation and the resources to commission works that celebrated and reinforced their power and authority. Anthony van Dyck was a Flemish painter who trained under Rubens. Charles I was a king of England, best known for getting his head chopped off during the English Civil War. But you can see how this painting reinforced his power and authority while he still had it. On to the first of today's Baroque superstars, Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens was a classically educated humanist scholar and a diplomat who was knighted by both Philip IV of Spain and Charles I of England. Although his father was a Calvinist, he was raised a Catholic in Flanders, a Catholic bastion of the Holy Roman Empire. Rubens traveled to Venice as a young man, where he was deeply influenced by Titian and Caravaggio. He also studied Greek and Renaissance sculpture, and like so many Baroque artists, was blown away by our old friend, the Laocoon. Here you see Rubens' Baroque Descent from the Cross, which you've already encountered, next to Titian's High Renaissance Entombment, which I didn't include in your group exercise. So what similarities and differences do you observe? Well, both painters use deep, rich colors and employ light for emphasis. Rubens was also influenced by the way Titian's looser brushstrokes captured the play of light, as you see in the detail of a cloak on the left and the woman's hair on the right. Another similarity with Titian, they both loved to paint female flesh, although Rubens' nudes tended to have a lot more of it. By the way, I left out differences. An obvious difference is that Rubens employs the diagonal composition so beloved of Baroque painters. Oh, and here it comes. But note that the composition of the works is quite different. The twisting figures and diagonal line of Rubens' deposition clearly mark it out as a Baroque work. And here on the right is Caravaggio's Entombment. Note that both paintings again employ a diagonal composition, but Rubens' colors are brighter, and his chiaroscuro is not as sharply defined as Caravaggio's. The Rubens painting that the College Board chose for the list is not, however, one of his Counter-Reformation religious paintings, but instead one of a series of 24 paintings that Rubens made for a royal political patron, in this case the former queen and regent of France, Marie de' Medici, that talks about political paintings in the Baroque era and shows several of the works from this series. A little background. Marie de' Medici was the wife of Henry IV of France, himself one of the most interesting figures of this stormy historical era. A Protestant, Henry IV fought two other Henrys. It's actually called the War of the Three Henrys over the right to rule France. He won, but only after converting to Catholicism to persuade Catholic Paris to accept him. Henry IV needed a Catholic wife, and Marie de' Medici came well connected to the Roman hierarchy. You recognize the last name, right? Henry IV was assassinated in 1610, and Marie became regent for her young son, Louis XIII. She wasn't a great ruler. The chaos that Henry IV had suppressed returned to France, but she fought hard to stay in control. Eventually, her son, with the help of his minister Richelieu, banished her from the court. Marie and Louis reconciled a few years later, and she remodeled the luxurious Palace of Luxembourg to hold these paintings, which were part of her propaganda effort to regain political influence in France. It didn't work, by the way. In 1631, Louis XIII banished her again, this time from France, and she died in exile. But Marie de' Medici had the money to pay her bills, so Rubens took the job. Still, the cycle presented some real artistic challenges. Marie de' Medici wasn't nearly as important as she wanted to portray herself, especially on so many canvases. So Rubens had to stretch to elevate her status, mostly by painting the queen hanging out with a lot of mythological figures. So in the painting on the left, which showed up on past AP tests, though it's not a required work, Marie de' Medici is arriving in France from Italy. Note that a personified France kneels before her, and below her, 3 sea nymphs and the god of the seas celebrate her arrival, holding the ship steady so that she can disembark safely. In the Felicity of the Regency on the right, Marie is shown in allegorical fashion as the personification of justice, flanked by a retinue of some of the primary gods in the Greek and Roman pantheon who personify various royal virtues. So, back to our required work. I trust you watched the Khan Academy podcast about this work, since I won't repeat all of their excellent points. There's a little truth underneath all of this gopher Baroque mythological allegory. The king did receive portraits of his future bride. Here's one portrait of a young Marie de' Medici that survived and looks a little like the one in the Rubens painting. But the king was not immediately smitten. He was very devoted to his mistress at the time and caught up with affairs of state. When his advisor announced the finalization of the marriage contract, Henry exclaimed, "You say I must be married, so I simply must." Doesn't sound all that enthusiastic. But Rubens, who knew who was paying for these portraits, pulls out all the stops. Jupiter and Juno, accompanied by their symbols, the eagle and the peacock, look down benevolently. The ancient gods of marriage and love, Hymen and Cupid, to the left and right, respectively, hover in midair as they present this portrait to Henry IV, the King of France. The flaming torch in Hymen's left hand symbolizes the alleged ardor of his love. The painting isn't especially subtle about the benefit that Marie de' Medici will bring to the marriage. Henry IV was almost 50 and he needed an heir. Marie gave him 6 children, which was arguably her biggest political accomplishment. Note that the only figure in the entire work who stares directly at the viewer is Marie de' Medici in her self-portrait. So the painting draws our initial focus to her. It's interesting that artists more often portrayed female figures as objects to be gazed at. Male figures usually held the main focus and power in the work. So, let me confess, I'm not a huge Rubens fan, no man crush, but I really like this painting. It's the one I would have put on the list if they'd made me a member of the College Board ruling junta, and it showed up on past AP tests before the new list was issued. Rubens was not only a court painter, but he was also a diplomat. He tried unsuccessfully to negotiate peace between Catholic Spain and Protestant England in hopes that the England would stop funding the rebellious Dutch. Rubens' diplomatic efforts did not succeed, but it gave him a front row to the horrors of war and a personal stake in bringing them to an end. In this allegorical painting, we see Europe flinging up her arms in despair. We see figures that represent the arts being trampled. The Fury Electa, who represents the horrors unleashed by war, appears almost demented. That's the lady in black. Again, this is vintage Rubens. Note the extreme sense of movement, the dramatic and rather light use of color, sometimes described as coloristic, the full-figured ladies, the use of mythological symbols. Rubens, if you'll pardon a little punning, is ripe for an attribution question. I need to move on, but let me make one more point about Rubens. This is something I could really imagine showing up on the test. Rubens ran his studio as a veritable painting factory. He employed a large workshop of assistants. They would do much of the actual painting, following oil sketches and detailed drawings which Rubens provided. He would supervise their work and make changes where necessary, and he finished off all but the cheapest productions with the touch of his own hand. Rubens considered people his specialty, and he often turned to others for help with plants and animals. One of his closest friends and collaborators was our old buddy Brueghel. In this painting, Rubens apparently painted Adam, Eve, and the horse, and left most of the plants and animals to Brueghel. They both signed the work. Okay, off to Spain. In geopolitical terms, the 1600s were not kind to Spain. The gold from the New World brought runaway inflation, and the religious wars depleted Spain's treasury without obliterating Protestantism or even preserving Spain's rule over the Netherlands. Yet these years of decline would bring the greatest flowering of Spanish painting. Philip IV was Philip II's grandson. Philip II was king of Spain during its golden age. His court painter, and among the greatest painters of the Baroque era, was Diego Velázquez. Velázquez did the best he could with unpromising material. Philip IV had a particularly exaggerated form of the Habsburg chin. The painter basically steals our attention away from this unfortunate face by painting the king's elegant clothing in superb detail, something that will remain a trademark of Velázquez. So here's a famous work by Velázquez, not on the list. But whose influence do you see? So I warned in my last lecture, the answer so often turns out to be Caravaggio. So what Caravaggio elements can you identify? Well, the central figure looks rather like one of Caravaggio's sensual boys, but we also see theatrical spotlighting, the pronounced chiaroscuro, and the open construction that spills out of the canvas. On the other hand, the tenebrism is a little less pronounced, a little more like Rubens' modified chiaroscuro and colorism. And while this is a mythological and not a biblical scene, it seems to me that here again we have the world of the gods dropping down into the lives of ordinary people. And here we move from quasi-genre scene to the formal paintings of nobility that became Velázquez's trademark. This painting, which you saw in your homework reading, commemorates a Spanish victory over the Dutch. Their last, as it happens. The Dutch won Breda back just a few years later. So this is one of the most famous paintings in art history. Sister Wendy calls it the greatest painting in the story of painting, although we're not going to see that clip. Let's start with your reactions. Why was this painting such a big deal? A few more questions. Where is the light coming from? Well, look toward the middle of the painting on the right. That's the Prime Minister of Spain and Velázquez's paymaster. He's opening the door to let in light. Actually, art historians still debate what's going on in this painting. Are the king and queen watching Velázquez, who's painted at his own easel, paint their daughter? Is the princess looking out at her parents, reflected to us in the mirror? Or is she looking at us? Note the shout out to Jean van Eyck's Arnolfini marriage. So here are a couple of details from the painting. We see Velázquez wearing the mark of nobility that he actually hadn't managed to attain yet, although he will. It was painted on later. And the couple in the mirror are pretty clearly the king and queen. That chin is a dead giveaway. Are they included to make this a more complete family portrait? Are they included because they're the subject of the painting? Maybe to suggest that Velázquez is almost a member of the royal family, privy to their most intimate moments? While the little princess is clearly the painting's central figure, note how she's bathed in an almost theatrical spotlight. It's her dwarf maid of honor whom I find the emotional center of the painting. Velázquez imbued her face with enormous dignity. This is a woman who has not let deformity defeat her. So what else do you notice about the brush strokes? Look especially at the little princess's sleeves. The brushstrokes are broad and easily visible. Remember that art historians use the term loose to describe this kind of brushstroke. The paint is actually laid on quite thickly in a technique you've encountered before. Do you remember the term? It's impasto. Well, I don't know how much time you have, but I'm hoping you'll be able to close with this clip from an old but excellent series, Art of the Western World. You've seen some of it before. You should recognize the fellow who's explaining Las Meninas to us, or at least you should recognize his voice. It's our friend Simon Schama, only he's a lot younger here. Well, I was a lot younger when I first saw this painting too. In our next lecture, we will continue with Spanish art, but the art of New Spain, what we now call Latin America.